Hi guys, Mark here again, and this is episode 44 of Reexamining the End Times, and we are studying my book, The Threshold of Exile. It was completed in 2024, published in 2024. Love to have you pick up a copy if you have an opportunity on Amazon. As I said, this is episode 44. We've been going through the book, expanding somewhat on the book. And the basic premise is understanding the importance in terms of our eschatology on understanding Israel's place in the purpose of God at the time of Jesus in the first century and how that affects our understanding of eschatology. And you will see pretty quickly that my perspective is not as common today with what we call a futurist perspective, where there's a coming Antichrist and tribulation, all this stuff is future. But I'm suggesting to you, as many scholars have understood, that much of this story in terms of our understanding of end times really is first century history. And we have gone through, as I said, the background in part one of the book tells you a little bit how I came to these conclusions. In part two, we've studied the Olivet Discourse, and I tried to demonstrate that all Jesus was talking about with the wars and rumors of war and coming clouds of glory and the destructions and the tribulation really is all evidenced in first century, not only in the history but in the Bible itself, and the language and style, or what we call the linguistic style which Jesus spoke, reflects back on similar circumstances in their previous destruction of the city and temple in 586 BC. And remarkably, those two events happened on the same day of the year, what the Jews call the 9th of Av, which is a great day of mourning and fasting for the Jews. It was the destruction of their temple, two separate invasions, one in 586 BC by the Babylonians, and then this last one in 70 AD. And as I've been saying and will continue to say, this is not an indictment against Jewish people in general. It is simply a reflection of historical context of how the gospel impacted the civilized world. And this is all part of the redemptive story, a very significant part of the redemptive story. And so we are looking at these things through the lens of a first century context and how that impacts our understanding of eschatology. And I have suggested to you, and will continue to suggest to you unapologetically, by the way, that we have taken many things that Jesus and the apostles were forecasting for their own generation, and we've catapulted them out into the future as if they had to do with us. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't learn from all Scripture, but the prophetic events that they were speaking of, the specific prophetic events, already happened. And I would include at least most of Revelation with that. And I don't have a perfect, fully orbed eschatology here. I'm not saying I have every question answered, but I believe that this is largely history, okay? And we've tried to demonstrate that through the Scriptures, letting the Scriptures interpret the Scriptures, not just my own harebrained ideas, but letting what do the Scriptures say about these things? And so this, then we came to the third part, and we took kind of an interesting turn, because the third part brought in another theological idea that is affected by our understanding of this historical context, and it has to do with the destiny of the lost. Now, I'm not a universalist. I've never suggested that everybody in the end gets saved. I'm not criticizing people who believe that. I'm just saying that's not my personal belief. I believe in the final separation of the wicked and the just. However, I don't believe that the final judgment upon the wicked is eternal torment in hell. Now, I know you say, well, what about this text? And well, we went through those texts in the book and in previous podcasts to kind of demonstrate how many of these things are taken out of context, and we look at them in context, we realize they say nothing of the sort, okay? Now, there are a few texts we still have to go through in Revelation, and we're coming close to getting into those, but I believe the end of the wicked is death. That doesn't mean that there's no time of judgment. Maybe there'll be a quote-unquote some kind of lake of fire, burning or punishment or something like that. But I do not believe it is a permanent state for unbelievers. Yes, of course, the righteous will be in heaven with the Lord. I have no questions about that. But I think the Scriptures, it's not because I think that hell is yucky, to put it that way, all right? It's because I don't see, and many others do not see, that the Scriptures actually teach that is the final destiny of the lost. And so I encourage you to go back and take a look at those previous episodes and get caught up to where we're at right now. It'll help you give you some context, because now this fourth part of the book deals with the book of Revelation, and we've been going through the book of Revelation and trying to see evidences of a first century reality, and discovered, I think, some very interesting ideas from various texts of how they point to a first century, this is first century activity. And we just finished chapter 12, and we had this vision that John sees of the woman, the firstborn, and the son that she gives birth to. He speaks of other offspring. He speaks of the dragon. And what we're going to see now in this part of Revelation, we're going to see some of the main earthly players and some of the spiritual forces that are at work behind them. And this is very consistent with how Daniel describes in Daniel 2 and 7, how Daniel sees these especially in 7, sees these spiritual forces behind the beasts. And but in 1, just a quick review of 12. In 1, we saw this woman clothed with the sun and standing on the moon, having 12 stars, and we suggested that this is spiritual. This is spiritual Israel. This is the Israel who has received Jesus as the Messiah. It's also reflective of the Jerusalem from above. Paul speaks of in Galatians 4, who is our mother, and we see her giving birth to Jesus. But we don't see his death in this text. He's taken right up to the throne. Because why? Because he's the firstborn of the resurrection. He's the firstborn of the new creation, as we're taught in the New Testament. Okay, and so and he's the firstborn of the community of the resurrection, because we are raised with him. Okay, and so we're considered part of that resurrection community. But yet she's in labor. But then we see this dragon. And this dragon is ready to devour the child, and the dragon, we suggested, is this beastly figure, which is the power, the enemy, the Satan, the power behind the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire here is seen with 10 horns and 7 crowned heads, or heads with diadems. The diadem is kind of a tiara kind of looking band. Okay, and so the 10 horns would refer to 10 different leaders, that from Julius right on through to Vespasian. But the 7th, because there's only 7 crowns, 3 of those leaders were just interim leaders by the name of Galba, Otha, and Vitello, that briefly took power after Nero's death. And so they really were never recognized as, or deified for that matter, as as emperors. Okay. And then we also saw this dragon's tail that swept the stars, and I would suggest to you that tail is the false narratives. Okay, it's the false narratives of the zealots and the aristocracy, and it swept and caused a third of the stars to fall from heaven. Well, much like Lamentations 2:1, where he says, Lord, you've cast the glory of Israel from heaven to earth. Israel was understood to be a heavenly people, okay, and they fell to earth, okay, and they fell to earth partially because of the false narratives that we're embracing, that came from the zealots, it came from the aristocracy, that were talking about the zealots wanted them to battle Rome, aristocracy wanted them to be pro-Rome, and we're going to see the significance of that in that both narratives were false, and we'll see the significance of that in the next chapter of Revelation. But also this idea of the tail being the false narrative is seen vividly. Isaiah 19 and 15 says that the prophet who speaks lies is the tail. Okay, the elderly man is the head. The prophet who speaks lies is the tail. And so we're seeing this false narrative symbolizing that there was a false narrative. And these two images actually are carried into the next chapter, where one is a sea beast which arises from the nations, which is Rome, and then a land beast which arises out from the land of Israel itself. Not an earth beast, it's a land beast. It's gay, the land. The theater of Revelation is the land of Israel, okay? And then, as we said, Jesus is caught up, and the woman in verse 6 of chapter 12 flees to the wilderness, being protected. And this is actually one of 4 allusions to the Exodus, believe it or not. In 12:6, let's go back for a second and say that Revelation 11:8 told us that where the Lord was crucified, the great city is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. Jerusalem is symbolized in the Old Testament as Sodom and Egypt. And we're told that the woman fled, escaped from this the city. And then in 12:6 she flees to the wilderness. And then in 12:14 she's eagle-born, and that's reflective of Exodus 19. And then in 12:15 and 16 there's a flood that she escapes. And so we have all of these allusions to things that happened in the Israel fleeing Egypt, spiritual Egypt. They're fleeing to the wilderness, which Israel did. They were eagle-born, as God said in Exodus 19, I bore you on eagle's wings. And then finally a flood that they're able to avoid being flooded over, as the Egyptians were flooded over in Exodus. Then in 7 and 8, by the way, that would be indicative that this is a Jewish company. Everything here seems to indicate that this is a new Jerusalem, a new Judaism, a new people of God under Christ. Okay, she's clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet, which is a lesser luminary, which I suggest is the law. She's clothed with the sun, which is Christ's righteousness. The 12 stars that she has over her head would be indicative of the 12 tribes, because back in Genesis 37 we learned that the 12 stars that Joseph saw in his dream were the 12 sons of Israel. And this crown that she's wearing is Stephanos, which is a victor's crown. Okay, and so all this is indicative of a people of Israel who have met their Messiah, who are being faithful to Messiah, and then they're fleeing Jerusalem in the face of the coming siege. And so now in 7 and 8, a war takes place in heaven, and I suggested that occurred at the ascension, began at the ascension of Jesus, when in Hebrews 9 we're told that he went up and like Moses cleansed the earthly tabernacle with blood, all the utensils and everything, Jesus had to do the same thing. But that was just a reflection of what was going to happen in Jesus' day when he offered himself on the cross and shed his blood, that he went into the heavenly sanctuary and cleansed God's heavenly sanctuary. Well, of course, there's now, with all that being cleansed of the stench and the filth of Satan, the accuser, the war ensues, and he's going to be thrown out of heaven. I don't think he wanted to be thrown out of heaven, do you? I don't think so. But there's a war, and he's going to be thrown out of heaven. Now, this just wasn't just, well, hey, the angels went out and tossed him. There's a war going on, and that war is reflective of the tribulation and the wars and the rumors of wars and all the conflict and all the violence that's going on earth at the same time over that 40-year period after Jesus' ascension, that whole time before the destruction of Jerusalem. This is a time of great tribulation and conflict. And so now the angels are thrown down. They have a short time. Satan and his angels are thrown down. They know that the time is about for the kingdom to arrive. And Jesus tied that he made that connection between the fall of Jerusalem and the arrival of the kingdom, and all this is seen in Matthew 24. Okay, when the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory, okay, would all be connected. The tribes of the earth would be the land would be mourning, and that would all be the fall of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And so this is all seen in 12:10. As the time for the kingdom to arrive, the saints are rejoicing, and it says that we're overcoming the accuser through the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they love not their lives unto death. But woe to those who are the land dwellers. And unfortunately, those are the Jews who refuse to receive Jesus. They're still part of the earthly people that land, who refused God's offer of forgiveness and redemption through Christ, and what's left is nothing but death and destruction that's about to be thrown upon them through the Roman Empire. And then finally in verses 15 and 16 and 17 here, we have just a remarkable image that the dragon is angry. He couldn't stop the son, Jesus himself, who's taken up to heaven. And so he's thrown down to heaven, and he's angry. And we see this remarkable imagery of, it says that he went out and threw a flood after the woman, but the earth or the land gobbled up or drank up the wrath, drank up the flood, and he was unable to destroy the woman. What a remarkable image here of seeing how the flood, which is the war, okay, and the land drinking it up, indicates the land as the theater of the war. The dragon is diverted by the zealots and by the Roman war, and he's unable to go after the church, which is his real target in all of this. He's not just interested in getting rid of Jews. He's interested in getting rid of the whole God-centered, Christ-centered economy of whether it's Jews or Gentiles. He wants to get rid of all of it. And as he goes to go after the Jews, after the church, the war diverts him, okay? And there's a lot of history behind this, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit later yet. We've got a few more sessions before we get into that specifically. But what a remarkable image is we see the land as sort of becomes a friend of the church, and it swallows up the conflict, the theater of the conflict, swallows up the dragon's wrath and makes the dragon unable to pursue the church. And so that's kind of where we leave it off in Revelation 12. I know that was a quick overview, but that gets us where we are right now in Revelation 13. In Revelation 13, we're going to see a couple of beasts, and we're going to get a little bit more of a breakdown of what was going on in the sort of an anatomy of the power structures in the Roman Empire, in the Roman world, and in the land of Israel. And so this seven-headed, 10-crowned beast, we've said, is Rome, and he has taken the express image of the dragon from chapter 12. And let's see, we don't want to go back over everything we just went over, but I think it's important to see the John's sea beast, we point out, and that would be in verse 2. It says that the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and its feet were like a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth, and the dragon gave its power and throne and great authority. So here's very interesting. This is the fourth beast of Daniel's vision in Daniel 7, and he saw it as something more scary. He was mesmerized by this thing. He was wondered greatly at this beast, because the others he could see as, a lion, a bear, a leopard. But this other beast was just more fierce and greater than all of them. And we see in maybe a little bit of why when John tells us that this beast has all these characteristics of Greece, Persia, and Babylon. And so what we're being told here is that it has integrated the power of all of these other empires, and what we might say is that they're right from the 7th chapter of Daniel, but in reverse order. It's like he's now assimilating all of this into himself. Now, this is not unusual. Let me see if I can get that page for you. What Daniel is seeing is, both Daniel and John is seeing how this dragon, this most powerful of all, is basically consuming or assimilating to himself the powers of these lesser principalities. And so we can see that they were subordinate principalities under the dragon or under Satan in Daniel 10. He says, we see that the angel of the Lord was informing Daniel that he was engaged in conflict with the prince of Persia, who was trying to hold power, while the prince of Greece was aggressively trying to seize dominance in the civilized world. Now, there are different interpretations of that, but the key point is he's calling them princes. He's referring to them as princes. In Daniel 13, we see 10:13, he says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. So the angels specifically referring to them as principalities. They're subservient to the dragon, and they were the beasts behind the two empires that are described in Daniel 7. But this fourth beast being more terrifying, what we learn is that he assimilates the power of these other principalities to himself. That's why you see this dragon, and he's turning and absorbing the powers of these lesser principalities into himself. And John sees it in reverse chronological order, as we said. that the dragon begins with the most recent, which would be Greece, and then works backwards through the Persian principality, and then finally the Babylonian. The fierceness of this, the fearfulness of this, that Daniel was wondering, isn't that in fact the full power of the dragon, the enemy of God, was now concentrated in one empire, Rome. Now this may seem like a strange vision or a strange way of looking at it, but this was not something that was unusual as understood in the ancient world. Dr. Lionel Corbett, professor and psychologist, wrote a book called The God Image. And in it he stated how the assimilation of the power of lesser gods by a greater god was something common in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. He says that the image of a god or a goddess might develop as local gods were assimilated into the gods of invaders. For example, when the Babylonians absorbed the older Sumerian gods, the Babylonian god Marduk was considered to be ruler of the whole world as he assimilated the powers of the lesser gods in the second part of the second millennium BC, and that would have been probably a few hundred years before the time of Moses. And so we see this fearsome image that Daniel was terrified. Something about this, here he saw, and he couldn't explain what it was. He didn't know what it was. All he knew was there was this fierce beast that he didn't describe as a bear, or he didn't describe it as a leopard, or it was just this terrifying beast. Well, when John sees it, it has integrated all of these powers, because it is now Satan himself, the dragon himself, who has taken all of the power of these prior principalities. He's absorbed them into himself as one great power, concentrating on the destruction of the church and Israel, to thwart and destroy and put to nothing the purposes of God. Then we learn in verse 3, that there is a mortal head wound that occurs. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal head wound in verse 3, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole land marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast? Who can fight against it?" And if we go on a little farther, the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. You notice it wasn't the temple. Those who dwell in heaven, that's the church. And also was allowed to make war on the saints and conquer them, and authority was given to it over every tribe, people, language, and nation, and all who dwell on the land will worship it. Everyone whose name was not written before the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. And I'm going to sit on verse 10 for just a moment. Of course, there's a variety of historical possibilities concerning the mortal head wound and of the sea beast. But one of the most common is the suicide of Nero, because the suicide of Nero in 68 AD brought utter chaos to Rome, and it came to near collapse as the next year and a half was what's called the Year of Four Emperors, as different people vied for the throne. There was famine, there was chaos, and there was attempt by Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Each died violent deaths trying to take control of the empire. But in 69, Vespasian was appointed emperor and brought stability back, and so this mortal head wound, you might say, was healed. Okay, and so now we have this resurgence, this resurrection, if you will, of the Roman Empire, and people are looking at it and marveling, saying, how did this great empire come back from the dead? Basically, I mean, it was near collapse. So much was going completely wrong, and devastation was occurring. And it comes back to life. And don't forget, that the war had been suspended. Again, we're going to deal with this a little bit more detail in a couple more chapters, but the war was suspended while all this was going on, and so there was a sense of in Israel that maybe they had gotten a reprieve on their on the destruction. All right, and so this revival of the empire and this newness now that came with, and the new vision of the empire that came with Vespasian's reign, caused people to say, hey, and they worshipped Vespasian just like they had worshipped Nero, and they had worshipped Claudius, and they had worshipped Augustus. And so there was this great joy at the recovery of the empire. And it says that they, worshiped the dragon. Well, the worship of Caesar was inadvertently worship of the dragon, because the dragon was, in fact, embodied that empire. So the worship of Caesars was really the worship of the dragon who was behind that empire. And needless to say, history records the arrogance, the blasphemy, the aggressive persecution of the church that ensued in those times. But we're told something very interesting in Revelation 13. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. In verse 10 says this: if anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is the call for endurance in the faith of the saints. The saints were to be patient in suffering. As God's sovereign plan was being played out, there were destinies being fulfilled. That's why we hear these closing words. Here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. The description of the first beast concludes with the admonition to the Christians that they remain patient in suffering. The Holy Spirit admonishes the suffering believers that they were not to align with either Jewish resistance, those with the sword, or the Romans who prosecuted the war against Israel. They were not to take up arms, engage in the conflict with either side. The Christian's warfare is spiritual, and our allegiance to Christ, to him alone. They were being plainly warned that any attempt to either defeat or align with Rome or the Zealots would only result in great loss and ultimately death or captivity. This admonition is given to the churches to persevere and resist, to take up the temptation to take up arms, especially while under persecution, which reminds us of Paul's earlier admonition to his churches. He tells us in Ephesians 6, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, and against the world forces of darkness and the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 and 4. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, for our weapons of our warfare are not flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. The captivity mentioned here that we've just mentioned in Revelation 13 echoes Jesus' declaration in the Olivet Discourse, where the outcome of this great conflict is affirmed. He tells us in Luke 21, they will fall by the edge of the sword, they will be led captive into the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Well, to just close with an interesting text from Jeremiah, if there's any question about this being a first century reality. We read in Jeremiah 15, on the brink of the Babylonian invasion, then the Lord said to me, even though Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, my heart would not go with this people. Send them away from my presence and let them go, and it shall be when they say to you, where shall we go? Then you shall tell them. See if this sounds familiar. Those destined for death to death, those destined for the sword to the sword, those destined famine to famine, those destined for captivity to captivity. So I will stretch out my hand against you and destroy you, and I'm tired of relenting. This is specifically Revelation 13 alludes specifically to Jeremiah's exact statements having to do with the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Those same words now are applying to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. He goes on to say, I will winnow them, which is precisely the words of Matthew 3. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor. I will winnow them with a winnowing fork at the gates of the land. They did not repent of their ways, and I will bring against them a destroyer at noonday. I will suddenly bring down on her anguish and dismay. We're going to leave it there. I know there's a lot there to try to navigate through. Hopefully I explained it well for you. It's not all perfect. It's not all crystal clear, but I think there are clear evidence there in all of this that we're dealing with the Roman Empire and the invasion of Rome upon Israel in the first century, which again just gives us more strength to the argument that we're dealing not with some future world-dominating Antichrist, but we're dealing with a first century Roman Empire in their invasion of the land of Israel and all the chaos that attended.